August 1944, Crossville, Tennessee. The cattle car doors screeched open, and the first thing 16-year-old Lukas Fischer felt wasn't the cold steel of a firing squad. It was the humid embrace of a southern afternoon. He blinked hard, his flaxen hair matted with the grime of the Rhine. Beside him, I waited for the guards to level their rifles. We had crossed an ocean expecting a shallow grave. But as Sergeant Thomas Gable leaned against the fence casually tossing a baseball in the sun, the nightmare we were promised vanished. Subscribe to join us for more untold chronicles of the Second World War. The heavy iron bolt on the sliding door did not just move. It screamed. It was a high-pitched, rusted screech that signaled the end of our journey, and we assumed the beginning of our deaths. Lukas Fischer stood beside me. His fingers dug so deep into the wooden siding of the cattle car that I could see his knuckles turning white through the layers of grime. He was only 17 years old, but his eyes were sunken and yellow, the look of a boy who had already seen the world burn and was just waiting for his own turn to ash. Lukas looked at me and whispered, "Matthias, is this where they do it?" I did not have an answer for him. I just watched as the door finally gave way, flooding our dark, suffocating world with a blinding golden light that felt like a physical blow. We had been packed into those cars like livestock for days, breathing in our own filth and the stagnant air of defeat. As the light hit us, Lukas shielded his eyes, his knees buckling. He expected to hear the sharp, rhythmic bark of commands and the metallic click of bolts being pulled back on rifles. That was the only way we knew how a story like any this ended.
I cannot see them. Matthias, are the rifles ready?
I stepped out onto the gravel, my boots crunching on the stones, and I braced for the impact of a bullet. But the air did not smell like gunpowder or the copper tang of blood. It smelled like dry grass and something sweet, like clover baking under a heavy sun. I blinked, trying to force my vision to clear. When it did, the sight was so impossible that I felt a hysterical laugh bubbling up in my throat. There were no firing squads. There were no pits. Instead, a few dozen yards away, a man in a tan uniform was leaning against a wooden fence post. He was not even holding a weapon. He was wearing a thick leather glove on one hand, and he was casually tossing a small white ball into the air and catching it. Thwack, thwack. The sound was rhythmic and peaceful.
"You boys look like you have seen a ghost. Get down from there before the heat finishes what the war started."
Sergeant Thomas Gable did not even stand up straight as he spoke. He did not yell. He did not spit on us. He just looked at our ragged line of skeletal figures with a sort of bored curiosity. He tossed the ball one last time, caught it with a loud snap of leather, and shoved it into his pocket. Lukas was still trembling, his feet glued to the floor of the train car.
He is lying. He wants us to walk into the open so they have a better angle.
I reached back and grabbed Lukas by his thin shoulder, pulling him forward. I told him to look at the man's face. Sergeant Thomas Gable was not looking at us like enemies. He looked at us like we were a chore he had to finish before dinner. He pulled a pack of cigarettes from his pocket, tapped one out, and lit it with a silver lighter that flashed in the sun. The smell of real tobacco drifted toward us, a rich, earthy scent we had not known in years.
"Move it along, Fischer. That is your name, right? It says so on the manifest. We have got a schedule to keep, and I am not missing my shift at the mess hall because you are afraid of a little Tennessee sunshine."
Lukas finally stepped down, his movements jerky and uncertain. He stared at the sergeant, then at the ball glove, and then at the lush green fields stretching out behind the camp. There were no guards in towers screaming orders through megaphones. There was just the low hum of a distant truck engine and the sound of cicadas buzzing in the trees.
Why are they not killing us, Matthias? We are the enemy. They told us the Americans would tear us apart.
I looked at the sergeant, who was now checking a clipboard, looking completely relaxed. I whispered back to Lukas that I did not know, but that for the first time in 3 years I did not feel like a target. I felt like a human being again, and that was the most terrifying feeling of all.
"Form a line 2 by 2. We are heading to the processing center. And quit staring at me like I am a 3-headed dog. We have got work to do."
We fell into a ragged formation, our shoulders slumped. As we marched past the fence, I watched the sergeant pick up the ball again. He was not watching us for a sign of rebellion. He was looking at the horizon, waiting for the next man to throw the ball back. The war felt 1,000 miles away, and as the dust from the road coated my tongue, I realized that everything they had told us about the world was a lie. He did not even have his holster snapped shut. He was not afraid of us. He was just waiting for the afternoon to end. The American sergeant, whose name tag read Gable, did not point his rifle at us. He simply waved a casual hand toward a low, sprawling building made of fresh timber. The smell of the wood was the first thing that hit me. It was the scent of a forest that had never seen a mortar shell. Lukas Fischer walked beside me, his steps heavy and uncertain. He was only 16, but his face was etched with the lines of a man who had seen the world end twice. As we approached the door, the sound of an idling engine vibrated through the soles of our boots. It was a heavy truck, and the exhaust did not smell of the foul charcoal gas we used in Berlin. It smelled of pure, high-octane gasoline. It was the smell of a country that had fuel to burn.
Form a single line, boys. We are going to get you cleaned up. Move it along now.
Lukas looked at me, his eyes wide and clouded with a terror that made my heart ache. He leaned closer to me, his voice a frantic whisper that barely rose above the hum of the truck.
Matthias, why are they washing us? I've heard the stories of what happens in the camps back home. They tell the prisoners they are going to the showers, but they never come out. Is this how it ends for us?
I did not have an answer that could soothe him. In the trenches of the Rhine, rumors were the only currency we had left. We had been told that the Americans were barbarians who killed children to save on rations. I gripped the boy by the shoulder, feeling the sharp points of his shoulder blades through his threadbare tunic. Keep your head down and do exactly what they say, Lukas. We are too tired to fight them anyway. If this is the end, at least we will die with the dust of that train out of our throats. We stepped inside the building, and the air shifted instantly. It was thick, heavy, and wonderfully warm. It wrapped around us like a blanket we didn't deserve. But it was the scent that truly paralyzed us. It was the smell of lemon and something chemically clean. It was the smell of peace. Sergeant Thomas Gable walked down the line, tapping his baton against his leg.
Take off those rags, every bit of it. Put your boots in the bins and your clothes in the furnace pile. You will not be needing those lice-ridden things where you are going.
Lukas hesitated, his fingers trembling as he fumbled with the buttons of his jacket. To us, that uniform was the only thing that proved we still existed. Without it, we were just shivering, rib-thin ghosts.
They are taking our clothes so we cannot run. They are going to line us up against the wall once we are naked. Matthias, I do not want to die in a bathroom.
I stripped off my own tunic, the fabric stiff with salt and dried blood. I looked at Lukas and tried to force a smile I did not feel. Look at the sergeant, Lukas. He is eating a chocolate bar. Men do not eat candy while they are preparing an execution. Just move. We stepped under the shower heads. I waited for the hiss of gas or the sting of freezing water, but what came next was a physical shock. It was hot. It was a torrential downpour of steaming, pressurized water that felt like a miracle. For 3 years, we had washed in icy puddles and stagnant troughs. Now the heat sank into our bones, melting the layers of fear that had frozen our hearts. Lukas stood directly under the stream, his mouth open, letting the water wash away the soot of the war.
Use the soap, kid. It is not there for decoration. Scrub hard.
He tossed a yellow bar of soap toward Lukas. It was thick and heavy, not like the sawdust-filled bricks we were used to in the barracks. When Lukas rubbed it against his skin, it turned into a rich, white lather that smelled of citrus. He stared at the bubbles on his hands as if they were diamonds.
Matthias, feel this. It is so soft. How can they have so much soap? Our mothers were boiling bones for grease, and these people have enough to make bubbles for prisoners.
I looked at the white lather swirling down the drain, taking the grey grime of Europe with it. The water remained hot, never wavering in its temperature. It was a display of wealth more terrifying than any tank or bomber. It was the sound of a civilization that had everything to lose, and yet gave it away to the enemy. As I watched Lukas scrub the filth from his neck, I realized that the dirt was the only thing we had brought from home. And now, even that was being taken away. We were being hollowed out, prepared for a new reality that our commanders had sworn did not exist. I looked at Sergeant Thomas Gable, who was leaning against the wall, whistling a tune I didn't recognize. He wasn't watching us for an escape. He was just waiting for the steam to clear so he could go to lunch. We stepped out of the bathhouse and into the blinding light of the Tennessee afternoon, our skin still tingling from the first real scrubbing we had received in over a year. The air did not smell of cordite or rotting masonry. Instead, it carried the scent of freshly cut grass and the faint, sweet aroma of pine needles baking in the sun. Sergeant Thomas Gable led the way, his boots crunching rhythmically on the gravel path. He did not carry his rifle at the ready. It hung loosely over his shoulder, as if it were a heavy piece of luggage he was tired of lugging around. He stopped in front of a long, low building made of clean white wood and gestured toward the door with a casual tilt of his head.
This is home for now. Find a bunk and stay put until the whistle blows for mess.
We filed inside like shadows entering a dream. The barracks were pristine. Rows of sturdy wooden bunks lined the walls, and the floorboards were polished to a dull shine that reflected the light from the large glass windows. There was no mud. There were no rats. I watched Lukas Fischer stop in his tracks, his eyes darting from corner to corner as if he expected a trap to spring from the rafters.
Matthias, look at the beds. They have pillows. Real pillows.
I grabbed Lukas by the shoulder and pulled him toward the back of the room, my heart hammering against my ribs. I had to remain the elder, the one who remembered the lessons of the fatherland. I had to protect him from the softness that was clearly a weapon of the enemy. Do not touch them yet, Lukas. Remember what the officers told us in the bunkers at Aachen. The Americans are a hollow people. They use these things to make us weak before they begin the interrogations.
But the radio said they were starving, Matthias. It said they had no shoes and their cities were burning.
It was a lie that felt heavier than the pack I had discarded weeks ago. I looked around the room and saw the evidence of a wealth that should not exist. On every bunk, there was a folded blanket made of thick olive drab wool. I walked over to the nearest one and reached out with a trembling hand. I expected it to be thin and rough, like the paper cloth blankets we had used in the trenches, but my fingers sank into the soft, heavy fibers. It was warm. It was real. It was better than anything I'd owned even before the war began.
They are not starving, are they?
I did not answer him. I could not. I looked out the window and saw Sergeant Thomas Gable leaning against a fence post. He had pulled a small silver lighter from his pocket and was lighting a cigarette. The smell of the tobacco drifted through the screen door, and it wasn't the bitter, dry scent of the scorched leaves we had been forced to smoke. It was rich and aromatic. It was the smell of a nation that had so much to spare that even their common soldiers smoked like kings. Sit down, Lukas. Just sit and do not say another word about the radio.
My father told me the Americans were cowards who hid behind their machines. But look at their machines, Matthias. Look at the trucks in the yard.
I followed his gaze. In the distance, a line of transport trucks sat idling. The sound of their engines was a low, powerful growl, steady and unbroken. There was no coughing of engines struggling with watered-down fuel. There was no black smoke of a dying motor. It was the sound of terrifying efficiency. I sat on the edge of the bunk, the wool giving way beneath me. For years, the voices from Berlin had told us that democracy was a rotting corpse, a decadent system that could not produce a single honest soldier. Yet here we were, washed and fed, sitting in a building that was cleaner than our command posts.
Do you think they will let us sleep here tonight, or is this just for the afternoon?
I do not know, Lukas. I truly do not know. I laid my head back against the pillow. It was stuffed with feathers, not straw. The silence of the camp was more frightening than the thunder of the artillery we had left behind. In the quiet, the propaganda began to shatter, falling away from my mind like the dry scales of a snake shedding its skin. We had been told the enemy was a monster, but the monster had given us soap and wool. I closed my eyes, terrified that when I opened them, the world would make sense again, and I would find myself back in the mud of the Rhine. Instead, the only thing I felt was the impossible softness of a clean blanket against my cheek. The sleep I found that first night in Tennessee was the deepest I had known since before the world went mad. I woke to a sound that was not the whistle of an incoming mortar or the screamed orders of a sergeant major. It was a bell. A simple, resonant chime that vibrated through the crisp morning air, echoing off the wooden barracks. Lukas Fischer sat up in the bunk beside me, his eyes wide and red-rimmed, his hair still smelling of that citrus soap from the night before. He looked at me with a question he was too afraid to ask out loud. I pulled my boots on, feeling the sturdy leather against my feet, and stood up. The barracks were filled with the sound of shuffling feet and hushed whispers as dozens of boys moved toward the door. We followed the line out into the golden morning sunlight. As we marched toward a large wooden building with steam rising from its roof, the air changed. Back in Germany, the air had always smelled of scorched earth, damp wool, and the bitter chemical stench of Urset's coffee made from burnt acorns. But here, the wind carried something that felt like a forgotten dream. It was the heavy, rich scent of roasting meat and the sharp, sweet bite of cinnamon. It was a smell that belonged to a home we had forgotten existed. Lukas Fischer gripped my sleeve so hard his knuckles turned white. He leaned in and whispered to me, his voice trembling.
Matthias, do you smell that? It must be a trick. The Americans are likely burning spices to hide the smell of something terrible. They want us to walk inside so they can finish us.
I wanted to believe him because believing him was safer than hoping. If I hoped, and I was wrong, the fall would kill me. We entered the mess hall in a single, silent line. The room was vast, filled with long wooden tables that shone under the glow of electric lights. At the far end, behind a long metal counter, stood a man who looked like he was carved out of solid oak. It was Sergeant Thomas Gable. He didn't have a whip or a rifle in his hands. Instead, he held a large metal ladle. He watched us with an expression that wasn't anger. It was something closer to pity, and for a soldier of the Reich, that was a harder thing to swallow than any insult. Sergeant Thomas Gable looked at the first boy in line and spoke in a booming, yet calm voice.
Move along, son. Grab a tray. Don't let the food get cold. There is plenty for everyone.
I watched Lukas Fischer pick up a metal tray. His hands were shaking so violently that the tray rattled like a drum. He reached the first station where a pile of bread sat. It wasn't the hard, black, sawdust-filled loaves we were used to in the trenches. It was white. It was so white it looked like fallen snow, and it was piled high in a wicker basket. Lukas Fischer stared at it, unable to move his feet.
Matthias, look at the bread. It is soft. It is like cake. It cannot be real.
I stepped up behind him and felt my own throat tighten. I reached out and touched a slice. It felt like a cloud. I took a piece and held it to my nose, and it smelled of yeast and honest flour. Behind the counter, Sergeant Thomas Gable leaned forward, resting his large hands on the edge.
Take 2 if you want, kid. We have 500 more loaves in the kitchen. Just keep the line moving.
Lukas Fischer looked at the sergeant with total disbelief. He spoke in a voice that was barely a breath.
500? For us? But we are the enemy?
Sergeant Thomas Gable didn't smile, but his eyes softened. He pointed the ladle toward a large pitcher.
You are just hungry boys. Now get your milk before I have to tell you twice.
Lukas poured a glass of milk. It was cold. It was so cold that condensation immediately formed on the outside of the glass. He took a sip, and his eyes squeezed shut. I did the same. The taste was thick and sweet, a liquid gold that coated my tongue and sent a jolt of pure energy through my starving system. We moved down the line where they heaped our plates with roasted turkey, steaming gravy, and mashed potatoes that were whipped into white peaks. There was a bowl of peaches in syrup that shimmered under the lights like amber. We sat at a table, but neither of us started eating right away. We just stared at the abundance. It felt like a physical blow to the chest. For years, the radio in Berlin told us that the Americans were starving, that their democracy had failed, and that they were a weak people living on scraps. Yet here we were, child soldiers of a supposedly superior empire, staring at more food in one meal than we had seen in an entire year of service.
They lied to us, Matthias. Every word they said was a lie.
I looked at the white bread on my tray and then back at Sergeant Thomas Gable, who was busy filling another boy's plate. They didn't just lie about the war, Lukas. They lied about the soul of the enemy. I picked up a fork, my fingers finally finding their grip. The first bite of turkey was so tender it fell apart on my tongue. The salt and the fat exploded on my palate. I looked around the room and saw dozens of other boys doing the same. Some were crying quietly into their napkins. Others were eating with a frantic, desperate speed. But most of us were just silent, overwhelmed by the crushing weight of a mercy we did not deserve and could not yet understand. Lukas Fischer took a piece of the white bread and slowly began to chew. He looked at me, a single tear tracking through the faint dust still on his cheek.
If this is what it means to be defeated, Matthias, then why did we fight so hard to win?
Lukas eventually returned to the ruins of Berlin, but he never forgot the taste of that Tennessee peach cobbler. He spent the next 40 years as a master baker, feeding a new generation with the same white bread that had once shattered his world. Lukas finally understood the bitter truth. You cannot beat a nation that throws away more bread in a single day than his entire village saw in a year. The Reich gave him a rifle and a lie. Sergeant Gable gave him a reason to live. Ideologies of iron eventually rust and crumble, but a single act of radical mercy echoes across a lifetime. Subscribe to help us honor the stories that history almost forgot. The characters, incidents, and dialogue in this video are dramatized for narrative and entertainment effect. While some events may be inspired by real-life themes, this story is a work of fiction.